Hi, I'm Suze Shaner, your host today of Community Forum, and I have the great pleasure to have with me tonight Steve Gardiner, who is here to talk to us about win-win problem solving. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Susan.
Great to have you on the show. I know we're going to get right into it, but I just wondered if you could give the viewers just a brief overview on your background and how you came to being, I'll call an expert in the win-win problem-solving space.
Okay, a couple things. I got started in corporate training and development. I spent 17 years with a paper company and forest products company running training and development. Did the same thing for 13 years in the pharmaceutical industry. And then 4.5 years ago, I had my career dream come true. Back in 1928, my grandfather, Glenn Gardiner, started Gardiner Associates, a management training firm, and he was credited with putting together the first foremanship training or supervisory training in the country. And so he did that. He was a prolific writer and trainer his entire life. My dad followed in his footsteps. And so I decided 4.5 years ago to carry on and relaunch Gardiner Associates.
So your grandfather really started the first management training company?
He wasn't the first management training company, but he was credited with actually creating the first supervisory skills training in the United States. And so I wanted to relaunch the third generation of Gardiner Associates. So I go all over the country, and my real passion is around conflict resolution, win-win problem solving.
Yeah, now I know you had your original training, was it the Harvard Influence Negotiation Project?
Yeah, did a lot of work through Harvard, has a great program. The Harvard Negotiation Project is a group of schools up there, MIT, Harvard, Boston, academics, people from all sorts of organizations, educators, people from business, people from unions, dedicated to teaching the collaborative way or the mutual gains approach. So I spent a lot of time going through their various programs years ago.
Yeah, I know. So we brought them in, when I was at IBM number of years ago, we brought in the Harvard Negotiation Project to teach us influence skills, like, you know, when we were working with our leaders on influence skills. So, and I know we were just talking off air, you said that you ended up through that working with William Ury, who wrote Getting to Yes, right?
Yeah, he and Bill Ury and Roger Fischer co-authored Getting to Yes, which contained and the win-win principles, which became very famous. And Bill and some of the other people from the Harvard Negotiation Project actually went to various countries that were at war and taught those win-win principles. And they were responsible, for example, for teaching Jimmy Carter how to use the win-win principles. And Carter was able to bring Menachem Begin of Israel over at Camp David, along with Anwar Sadat from Egypt, and they hammered out the accords and a peace agreement using those win-win principles.
Really? I think we could use a little of that today, but anyway, so do you have an example of a challenging client where you shared these skills and they were able to come to a good resolution for themselves?
Here, let me tell you what we did. Is because we were using the Harvard book, Getting to Yes.
Yeah.
And we were using it for our people in the forest products company. They were negotiating every single day to get rights for land or to swap lands and things like that. And so we were using that book and those techniques. And I got a call from the president of our company, and he said, "Hey, Steve, could we use those kind of principles for collective bargaining? Could you go down and teach the union leaders at a plant and the management team how to use those?" I said, "That's exactly the way those skills should be used." So we did that. That had never been done in the history of the forest products company. We had horrendous adversarial relations between the management teams and the unions. And so when we did it at that first one, we jointly taught them the win-win approach with all sorts of listening skills and how to see things from the other person's viewpoint. And at the end of that, we said, "Would you like to use this for collective bargaining?" And they said yes.
Both sides said yes.
Both sides said yes, and as a result,
like the union stewards and management said yes.
They said yes, and it was great because they negotiated using those skills, and as a result, they had probably the fastest agreement was reached, and it was implemented. And once we did it there, for the next 3 years, I went to every plant, every mill, and we did it everywhere like that. And it just became a real eye-opener because people started really listening to each other. Because you got to realize, they didn't trust each other at all. and they use nasty language most of the time. But by using those kind of principles that you got from the Harvard Negotiation Project, they were able to come to good
You know what? So I'm
win-win
curious. The first time, live in the collective bargaining process, and they were, anytime you try to learn a new skill, it's a little clunky. People aren't necessarily skillful at it. They're just learning. What was that like, really? I mean, was there some resistance to it? Were people... what was it like the first time that they actually, outside of the classroom, in a real life situation, they were actually trying to do it?
It was kind of interesting because what we actually did is we did the joint training, and then the decision was we are going to use it for bargaining. And I said, well, where do you want to do the bargaining? Well, we had done the training in a room, in an auditorium that had a stage, and they said, why don't we do it right here? I said, no. We've got to find a place where people can sit down in a very leisurely way, and not sit across a table.
It's a totally different environment, totally different setup, because there's a barrier here, right?
Exactly. So we didn't want them looking across a table. I said, is there any place we could use where there could be just some sofa chairs or something? And the union president said, well, we could go to the union hall. Well, a lot of the management people had never been in the union hall, and we went over there, and sure enough, they had a room with some sofas. And I said, "Is everybody okay with this?" And they said yes. And one guy said, "Yeah, we can do the bargaining here. The only guy that's going to object is old Willie." I said, "Who's Willie?" And they pointed to a picture on the wall. He was a traditional union guy who would never allow management in. But that was the breakthrough, is they realized by using these principles, they were going to have a much better agreement.
So that's interesting. So management had never been in there?
Nope.
Because they weren't allowed, they weren't invited in.
They weren't invited in.
And they obviously weren't interested in going in there.
Yeah. And so one of the things, I don't want to overdo this, but one of the nice things about using that kind of process in collective bargaining is, in the course of really listening to people, because that's a fundamental skill. Roger Fischer would tell you, he's passed away, he did a great job educating people around the world, and he said the most critical skill is being able to listen. So when you're teaching a bunch of union leaders and managers how to deeply, empathetically listen, you start to build, and they start seeing things from the other person's point of view, walking a mile in their moccasins. One of the things is they start in little itsy-bitsy ways building some trust during the course of that. It's not all roses, but it's a lot better than the traditional slam, the fist on the table.
Right. I mean, it's probably naive to think that it's still going to be it could be a challenging, tension-filled process along the way. You're going to have some moments, right?
Oh yeah, and what we taught them is we said, hey, listen, during the course of your collective bargaining, you're not going to start right off and probably talk about wages and pay
not
rates.
the highly charged stuff.
Yeah, you gotta start with some stuff that you can probably work through pretty quickly.
Giveaways,
yeah. And by the way, that's probably a lesson for anybody involved in win-win problem solving. Is the first time you try it, don't tackle the most difficult, long-lasting problem. You don't want to. You want to try something that you have a fairly good chance of succeeding, so you get a chance to actually see the process in action.
Okay, so you're saying this was successful. I'm curious in terms of the process, in terms of the results, the outcome. How would you characterize the difference between before they had the skills and after they had the skills? Like this first time using the skills, what were the results? How were they qualitatively different?
Okay, I think what you started to see is people doing very simple things, like not interrupting as much. Really listening. They would be summarizing conversations.
Yeah, that's active listening.
That's what they were doing. And that's what you really have to do. Because most people have not been trained to be good active listeners.
So in terms of in the process of the conversation, you were seeing some enhanced communication because people were actively listening, summarizing whatever they were doing, looking at each other. Really, you probably saw a lot of change in body language and with the intent to understand. What were the results in terms of the outcome of the conversations? Were they that different than before?
Yeah, because a couple of things would happen is people were starting, in the process of taking the time to really listen, and I should probably explain what the win-win principles are that might help this a little bit. But first, in really taking the time to listen, they were more respectful
Yeah.
It's not like they were going to go out and be good buddies.
Right.
But it was tangible. You started to see over the days of the negotiations, people would become more comfortable talking and more comfortable listening. And like I said, there'd be less interrupting and there'd be more clarification and things like that. Where this goes to is when you ask about the outcomes and you ask about the process, the basic win-win principles that come from the Harvard Negotiation Project and the Federal Mediation Service teaches them as well are 4 things. The first thing is to focus on the problem, not the person. In other words, attack the problem, don't attack the person. So that's one of the things that we started seeing.
Which is a basic management skill.
It's a basic
I mean, that's basic principles of management, right? Yeah, focus on the problem, not the person.
But in those days, it was very common for people to call somebody a nasty name. And they'd go back and forth. But we asked for some things. We started detecting there'd be less personal attacks. So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2 was to focus on interests, not positions. A position is the opening demand that somebody makes. It's and they might say it, very strongly. The traditional way of maybe distinguishing between a position and an interest is this. There were 2 sisters, the famous story about 2 sisters arguing over an orange. And they start, tugging at the orange, and they demand the orange, the other one demands the orange, and then one of them calls one of them a nasty name, and the other one, of course, retaliates and calls her a nasty name. And finally what they do is they pull the all-American compromise, they cut the orange in half. And each gets a half. But if you saw their faces, they were disgruntled because neither got what they really wanted. Had they taken the time not to just dwell on their positions, but ask the simple question, why, dear sister, do you want the orange?
What is it that you want?
What's the interest? What do you really want it for? That's what the interest is. The one sister would have revealed she needed the skin or the peel from one complete orange for something that she was cooking up. She was going to grind up the peel. She couldn't make the concoction now. The other sister needed the fruit or the juice from one orange for a drink she was making.
She each got half of what they wanted.
So by taking those demanding positions, exactly, they didn't get it. So obviously, when you take the time to ask that simple question that a 2-year-old can ask, why, you reveal the person's interest. And that's what we want to do, is don't waste your time, your energy, and get your blood pressure up.
Right.
By dealing with positions and demands, get to the interests. So number 1 was focus on the problem, not the person. Number 2 was focusing on the interest, not the positions. Number 3 is recognize that if you and I are having a disagreement, even though we have a disagreement, we both probably have some common shared goals. We have what we call mutual interests. So we want to discuss the mutual interests, but then we also want to talk about the separate interests. The mutual interests that the 2 sisters had, they both were interested in the orange. That's their mutual interest. They probably want to also improve their relationship because today they want to come up with a way to solve problems. Today the problem is an orange, tomorrow it could be a boyfriend or something like that they're arguing about. So they want to discuss what their shared or mutual interests are and then also respect the separate interests. Your one interest was for one sister, her separate interest was the skin, the other one was
I guess they couldn't go shopping.
Probably should have gone shopping.
And then you wouldn't have your example. No, I'm sorry, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
But that's the thing. What you want to do, principle number 3, is using both the mutual and the separate interests. Create options that incorporate both those. And obviously, the option here was to simply peel the orange.
Right. And then what's the 4th one?
4th one is to use criteria or objective standards rather than try to pull a power play when you decide on which option.
What's the criteria by which we're going to make the decision?
Well, the objective criteria that we're going to, for example, we use objective criteria all the time. If you were selling a house and I were buying a house, the objective criteria we go to multiple listing services, we go right online, and you could tell me that you would want a certain price, and I could want to offer you a certain price. But in this day and age, we can go to the computer and within seconds find out what your place is worth. That's the objective criteria, the standard.
So what would an example be with the sisters with the orange on the objective criteria for how they were going to solve this problem together?
In that particular one, they probably...
Don't do that. Don't do that.
what they probably, in that particular one, they weren't really using objective criteria. That would have been simple just to, in this case, if you want the skin and I want the juice.
That's an easy
That's
situation.
pretty easy. They didn't need to use any objective
Right,
criteria.
so that's an easy example where if they're really discovering what their interests are, that's clean, no conflict there.
Right.
But what if they both, this is a simple example, but what if they both wanted the skin, let's say?
Yeah. Well, then they'd have to get into some real creative brainstorming.
Right.
Is there any possible way that you could use it skin tomorrow? I could use it today. Could you do it tomorrow? And we'll find another orange.
Yeah.
That's what they probably have to do in that case.
Okay. So I just want to let them know that I want to see if there's any comments, and I can't quite call the comments up, so I do need a little help with that because I'm on a different show here. It's not our show right now. But we are going to take calls in a little bit. But before we do that, so do you have a way to demonstrate this?
I think the first thing that we usually do is very simple. This is a drill, an exercise that's been around forever.
Okay.
And you and I can do this.
Okay.
If you could put your hand up like this, just for a second.
Okay, we're going to arm wrestle.
And what we're going to do is we're going to take 10 seconds.
Okay.
The object of this exercise is to win as many points as you can.
Okay.
You would get a point if you put my hand down to the table. I'd get a point if I put your hand down to the table.
Okay.
All right? Mm-hmm. And so we're going to do 10 seconds, no talking. On your mark, get set. Susan, get as many points as you can. All right?
We're still.
We got just leave it like that. Our knuckles are white. What we try to illustrate to people is that there are 5 common ways to resolve a disagreement. Yeah. The first is both of us decide, hey, we're just going to avoid the argument. It's not worth it. So you go your way and I go my way. That's avoidance. The second thing is to accommodate. Accommodate would be is I just let my wrist go loose and I let you win. I accommodate. I put your interests ahead of mine. That's accommodation. The problem with accommodation, and I used to notice all the time in organizations.
Like resentment or something?
Yeah. People over time, if they get the reputation of what people call somebody who's always letting the other person win. They might call them a loser or a wimp. All right? And so people start resenting that. And then one day they get upset and they go postal. So we got to be careful with the combination.
We don't want anybody going postal.
Right. The next thing that people will commonly do, they can avoid, they can accommodate, they can compromise. Right. Now, probably somewhere in our school days, we learned the power of compromise.
You get one, I get one.
Yeah. But what we want to take a look at is a slightly different definition of compromise. And that's that when you compromise, one person wants this, one person wants this. To compromise, both people give something up. All right? And so what we want to, and the classic example is if one person wanted to go to Chicago and somebody else wanted to go to New York, and you split the difference and you compromised, where would you end up?
Yeah, that's kind of screwy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like.
I mean, that's a clear example where it's really screwy.
Yeah, you end up it's somewhere in the middle of Nowheresville, Western Pennsylvania. So anyway, that's the danger of a compromise. Neither person gets what they want. The other thing was, people will sometimes compete. And sometimes what I see is one person at the end of like 15 seconds, they get 1 point. And they feel real good. Yeah. But what I do is I like to take like a magic marker and use it as a microphone and pretend I'm Oprah Winfrey. And I ask the person who just won, how do you feel? And they throw their chest out and they feel really great because they won. Then you ask the person who didn't get the point, how do you feel? And what do you think their response is?
Well, they probably don't feel great.
They don't feel real good. And as a matter of fact, they feel, if we ask them, hey, if we gave you round 2, what would you do? Yeah. And they very often say, well, I go back and try to win. And so the danger in using a competitive strategy, it's fine to do that on the soccer field. It's fine to do that on the baseball field, to have a competition. But do we really want to compete within our organizations? We got to be careful, because sometimes the winner can feel pretty good, but the loser can feel pretty rotten. And in real life, sometimes the loser can make life miserable for the winner.
Yeah, oh sure. That can start all sorts of like backdrop kinds of behavior. behavior.
Backdrop kinds of behavior,
Yeah.
and a win-lose situation can deteriorate into a lose-lose.
Yeah.
So the fifth way to manage, and by the way, the other thing is, if you notice in a competition, we're getting all unraveled there. The other thing about a competition, we were both fighting for that. Neither one of us got a point.
Right.
Whereas the fifth way is to cooperate or collaborate.
Just say, okay, you
and
get a
go
point,
back,
I get a
boom,
point.
back
Yeah.
and forth and back and
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah.
Now, what's amazing is we do that drill usually in the first 45 seconds of a workshop, whether it's a joint union management workshop or just management workshop. And the reason is we want to see what people, to get them familiar with those 5 basic types. And then we say what we want to focus on today is that cooperative strategy. That's what the win-win is all about. And by the way, what's very interesting is, I'll never forget, I'd done this exercise. It's been around a long time.
Yeah.
I've been doing it for years. And then one day, I used to do it for 20 seconds. And 2 guys did this without talking. Is for 10 seconds, they went boom, 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 boom. And then they did a switch, boom, 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 boom. And neither one had done that exercise. I said, how'd you come up with that? And both of them were engineers, and they said, you're wasting a lot of time and effort when you go back and forth like that. So it's
That's very efficient.
It's efficient, and it's proving that you can always constantly improve everything.
Improve your process. That's very, very efficient.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, we will take calls tonight. If anybody, I'm curious if anybody who's listening has a situation that they feel either that they want to apply this to and they want to get Steve's advice, or maybe they're a little skeptical and they're not so sure it could work because their situation's somewhat complex. That might be kind of interesting. So we are open and willing to take calls, so I'm just going to put that out there. So if we get a call, we'll take your situation.
What's kind of fascinating is we in teaching this kind of stuff, you teach the basic skills of listening and seeing things from people's the other perspective, and then you practice on simple cases. And what we usually do is we ask people, hey, is there something going on in your neighborhood? Does somebody want to put a speed bump there? Or does somebody want to put stop signs where they're, or is somebody coming into and they want to knock down a nice forest and put in a mall? Or are there some controversies about the tax system with the school? And so these kinds of things can be, we use them in organizations, but we practice on some things that are going on in people's schools, churches.
Yeah, in the community. Because I would think that, it sounds very straightforward, very logical, focus on the problem, not the person, find out what both of your interests are, come up with some options. It sounds like very reasonable.
Yeah.
But the challenge is when people get emotionally involved and attached to what it is they want. And that's where we know neurologically the amygdala kicks in, and that's where they shut off listening or being flexible with their thinking. So the more emotionally charged it is, it seems like that would be the most difficult kinds of situations.
I'm sure in some of your other shows and in future shows, you've got an expertise in that, and you've got some other partners who can really address that. We have to do that a little bit ourselves. Because I'll never forget, because people are very upset.
Yeah.
I'll never forget one time they brought in John Kabat-Zinn.
I've taken classes with him,
They brought him into the Harvard Negotiation Project, and he was working with world-class or world-famous mediators and basically teaching them how to breathe and relax and not get into the fight or flight, because they're in situations where they might be mediating two sides that are at war, or they got murderers in the room, and so they've got to keep cool, calm, and collected, and they want to be a good role model. So we teach people, hey, if you're about to have a difficult conversation with somebody, pre-play it in your head. Think, what might the person say that might trigger an emotional response in you, and think that ahead of time, because then when it happens in real life, you won't go into that immediate reaction.
So you do some kind of pre-coaching before they're actually live in the situation. So if somebody's imagining the situation, they can try and think ahead of time, prepare themselves to decrease the likelihood that they'll get escalated or be emotionally charged in the situation. But it sounds like you don't necessarily you're saying other experts deal with how do you diffuse the situation in the moment?
Oh, in the moment, if it happens, let's say I'm going to be having a difficult conversation with you, and the night before, the morning before, I anticipate what you might say that could upset me.
Yeah.
And you say it, but then you say something that I hadn't anticipated.
Yeah, that triggers you.
What I got to do now is I got to just do what our grandmothers used to teach us.
Count
Take
to 10.
a deep breath and count to 10. Because the first thing that goes, we know, is when we get hijacked emotionally, our oxygen intake goes down. So you want to take a deep breath or two to reoxygenate, get some more oxygen in your system. The second thing you might want to do, and that gives you some time to think of an answer. Or very often we'll tell people, and we used to do this with the union leaders and the managers of the plants and the mills, take a time out. Say, hey, listen, Susan, I'm starting to lose my temper a little bit, and I don't want to go down that road. Could we come back at this afternoon or tomorrow?
Yeah, if somebody, I teach yoga and meditation.
Right.
And I've done a lot of work with coaching executives who might be working on keeping their amygdala in check, which, by the way, for the audience, that's when it can hijack the best intentions, where you might go into flight.
It's easy.
Flight, freeze, or
appease.
No, flight or fight. Fight or flight, but there's also freeze. Anyway, any of those reactions. And so the two things that you mentioned, so I just want to say this for our audience, is that the two things that you mentioned, count to 10, take deep breaths, or take a time out, literally what that does is it sort of energetically cuts the energy, but when you take a deep breath, because when you're in that mode, your sympathetic, it's physiological at that point. That's why you literally cannot be in your executive functioning, kind of your right mind, if you will, in terms of logical thinking. So your sympathetic nervous system is stimulated. So those other things will, the slow deep breathing, counting to 10, getting more oxygen in, from a physiological perspective, what that does is stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system. So it does physiologically bring things down.
Yeah.
So then your mind can be in that place. I just wanted to say that kind of like the scientific reason for it.
Yeah. And the other thing that we do is just a very, very simple technique, and this is what I actually saw John Kabat-Zinn doing with those mediators. And that's just, if I know I'm going to be having a difficult conversation with you, what I'll do is 2 minutes before I go into wherever we're going to meet, I will just close my eyes for 30 seconds, take 2 deep breaths, and then kind of take a mental vacation back to a place where I was 100% relaxed.
Yeah.
I see how blue the sky was at the ocean. I feel the breeze coming off the shore. I see the palm trees, brilliantly green, waving in the wind.
So you're doing that. You're doing that.
I do that before I go in to relax myself, knowing that I'm about to have a difficult conversation
that you
with
might potentially get triggered.
Yeah.
So that's part of your pre-coaching with people. I mean, you do that yourself, but it's also you pre-coach people to say, hey, go into this in a relaxed state.
Yeah.
Because you're going into a charged situation, and things could potentially, if left unmanaged, could escalate pretty quickly.
You're not going to believe this, but I actually was called to mediate a dispute in a huge church between the minister and the person in charge of the arts and the music and the choir. They were having such a fight. They were causing a civil war within the church. And I was asked by somebody to come in to mediate this. And I had to actually teach them that breathing exercise, and that because we taught them the win-win principles, but they still were going into fight or flight.
So I that's helpful, because that's what I was saying. What challenging situations have you had? Because again, on paper, it all sounds like, oh, okay, very logical. But many times in these kinds of situations, people are not logical because they're emotional.
They get emotional. To me, it's amazing because people have disagreements all over the place.
Yeah.
believe it or not, I have done conflict resolution, win-win problem-solving workshops for big ski areas. Because ski areas, I know a ski area, their instructors are unionized. And when they unionized, the ski area managers had never had to deal with a union before. And so they needed to understand how to use the win-win approach. That was at one ski area. Another big ski area, the ski patrol were organized in a union. And so it's amazing. You can use these problem-solving techniques in all walks of life.
Well, you know what? That's really interesting for you to cite, because the earlier example you gave, people might say, well, I don't work in a union environment. You know, that's not relevant for me.
Yeah.
And yet, all the time, whether it's out in the community, some of the community types of organizations or initiatives you mentioned, or, you know, obviously people inside companies, people always have different interests.
Yeah. Well,
right? That they're trying to negotiate.
Yeah, one of the things that we did, I've worked with a lot of school systems, with particularly the teachers. And we teach them the win-win approach, because it's not so much that it's not the kids that they're arguing with, it's not their fellow teachers, they have problems with the, but it's the parents. The parents are coming in demanding, hey, you gave my kid a B, he deserves an A.
Oh my gosh, that's happening more today.
Yeah, we teach the teachers how to use the win-win principles with the parents.
So that is interesting. So do you have an example where a teacher, or maybe it was a educational environment where they were having a particularly challenging time with very demanding parents?
Yeah, I will not mention the towns, but it was a pretty well-to-do town.
Yeah.
And so somebody came in to complain to the teacher that my child
should have
gotten an A, and you gave them a B.
Yeah.
And the teacher, it was amazing, because they took a deep breath, and they explained, actually, the work that your kid did, I should have given them a C. But because they tried so hard, I gave them a B. And it was just to explain, took the wind out of the sails of the angry parent. And by the way, the parent said, do you know who I am? And the person was a very prestigious member of not just the community, but the entire state of Connecticut.
Yeah.
So you can use these win-win principles to fend off people who try to pull a power trip on you.
I would think some of it would be, especially like the case with the teachers. I mean, look, parents are more demanding than ever these days, I think, in those environments. And some of it is just giving them the support and empowering them to feel like, okay, I'm in control here.
Yeah.
Like, some of it is just that. I'm in control here. I can pause. I can take a moment, because that could be intimidating for a teacher to be up against somebody who's in a powerful position and is essentially, probably not intentionally, but they're trying to get their way, and they could come across very intimidating.
You go back, you asked me before, what's the fourth principle of the win-win, and that's where you use objective criteria and not power.
Yeah.
The objective criteria that sometimes a teacher will have will show, I can show you the quizzes, the test results, and the homework.
Their whole rubrics that they're using.
And they've got it. And that's the objective criteria.
Right,
and that's why that got the B and not the A.
Yeah. But I mean, that situation totally reframes it differently.
Yeah.
To say, what they got a B, why didn't they get the A? It was like, to say, well, they really should have gotten the C, but I gave them the B. So then it's like, okay, they were really far away,
By the way, while we're in the school system, one of the really nice things in the last 10 years is more and more we're seeing schools, particularly at the middle school and high school level, where they're teaching these win-win principles to kids, and they're doing mediation, peer mediation.
You know what? And by the way, I want to just mention also, we can take calls. So if anybody, has just looking to see if there's any comments here. If anybody wants to call in, has any questions, feel free to call in. We're happy to take calls. If you have a particular situation that you want to get some free advice on, how about that? If you want to tap into Steve's expertise, you want some free advice, feel free to call in. But you know what? I'm heartened to hear that, because sometimes it's like, where would we all be if this was part of our education, starting from an early age? It was part of our paradigm to even think about a win-win situation, because the reality is people say, yeah, but at the end of the day, nobody gets everything they want.
Right.
And, we all have to figure out ways to live together. So the reality is, that's true. Is it really possible to get everything you want in negotiation situation.
Can't get it all. But I love it. It's one of my favorite things is to go in and watch these kids do peer mediation. They're just brilliant.
I mean, so if they can, first of all, be exposed to these skills, have an opportunity in an educational environment, which might be more supportive and feel maybe a little bit more safe than other kinds of environments, to practice these skills, and then by the time they're out, quote, in the real world, they've already have some level of skill, confidence, and comfort in practicing the skills. It gives me some hope for leadership for the future.
I want to go back because we're talking about all the ways that these ideas can be applied, but it all starts, we mentioned the Camp David Accords.
Yes.
The Harvard negotiation people also work very closely with when the Irish in Northern Ireland, the Catholics and the Protestants, they had a mediator come in and use the win-win principles with them to settle that conflict. It's the same thing, and the same thing when Nelson Mandela
was that. Can I just pause for there? Was that conflict actually settled through those principles?
Yeah, George Mitchell, who had been a senator from Maine, was a mediator for that, and he used those 4 win-win principles. Yeah. And it's interesting. I'll three things. I remember watching George Mitchell after they had the accord signed and had the peace agreement. They interviewed him and they say, "What was your trick, or how did you do this?" And he said, "For the first couple of weeks, all I did was listen. I wanted to hear what their interests were on both sides. I wanted to know what their fears, their concerns, their desires. I also wanted to role play for them the importance of listening." And so it was very interesting because later, Quinnipiac College invited the fellow who was the president of Sinn Féin.
Well, wait, so he just listened for a few weeks?
He just listened to both sides.
Asking questions, trying to understand for a few weeks.
Yeah.
So again, I just want to pause there because for the average person, many people can't listen more than 10 minutes.
Right.
So if he went there and he listened for several weeks and was just gathering information and was just seeking to understand, first of all, wise, patient, sage, I might say, but that takes incredible discipline.
Yeah. Well, to me, it was amazing because Quinnipiac University invited the president of Sinn Féin from Northern Ireland, the Catholic, Jerry Adams, came over and gave a talk. And I remember I asked him a question, and I said, how did you have that breakthrough? He says, for the first time in a century, we listened because they taught them how to listen.
A century.
Yeah.
A century.
Yeah, we hadn't been, we've been arguing and not even talking to each other.
Well,
I mean, he said the key was listening, and that's what George Mitchell said.
Yeah, but think about the context. Context is everything in that environment. So this gets to the level of emotional charge in that situation. I mean, many of these people had family members killed.
The same thing.
That brings it really home.
Yeah, I use these examples from history. Of stopping the war, having a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, having the conflict stop in Northern Ireland.
I mean, that can't be more charged.
Yeah, and it's very charged. Think of the other example at that same time, that same period of time. Nelson Mandela was being let out of jail.
Yes.
And the African National Congress was going to take over the government. Again, the people from the Harvard negotiation project went down, taught them the basic win-win principles, and they practiced. And so a lot of people expected a civil war and a bloodbath, but there was a peaceful transition of government there. And these are people who literally had people murdered.
Right.
So what I say is, if they can be used in such dramatic settings, do you think we can use it around our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our businesses? And the answer is yes.
Well, I think, like you mentioned earlier, you said really deep listening. Like most people listen long, there's different ways people listen. Some people listen and they're just looking at you and they're just waiting for you to stop so they can say what they have to say, right? So they're not really listening. And then some people actively listen, so they'll ask questions, paraphrase, but really deeply to listen, to really understand, especially in these situations, like where's their pain? Like what's really going on for them? Like you said, put themselves in the person's shoes, but really to do that, it it really requires, I mean, where does this come into play? It really requires curiosity, compassion, empathy, don't you think?
Yes, all those things.
So
what happens is you have to think of the larger goal.
Yeah.
You know, one of the classic cases that people have used in Win-Win is the ugly orange case, where there's two doctors arguing over, they both need, they need 3,000 oranges, and a special kind of orange. And one needs it to come up with an antidote for women who are pregnant, and they want to prevent birth defects in kids. And so they need this for an antidote, and they need 3,000. And then the other doctor needs the 3,000. It's oranges. Needs the 3,000 oranges to make a special serum to stop a leaking gas that could kill people.
Yeah.
These guys hate each other. They don't trust each other. They have lawsuits pending against each other. But using the win-win approach, they come to agreements. And so that's what's so amazing is when you get people, we teach them how to listen. We teach them very simple skills on how to listen, and then we give them these kinds of cases like that, and they see, hey, if it can be used on those kind of tough things, the greater goal for both these doctors was to save lives.
Yeah.
And so that's what you want to talk about with what are the mutual interests.
Right.
And so, you know, it could be keeping, I was down in Louisiana 2 weeks ago, and the mutual interest between the union and the management team down there was keeping the place open, you know, keeping people's jobs.
Yeah, everybody in that situation wants to keep their job, right?
Yeah.
So then their ears are a little bit more perked up. But so in this situation with the doctors, yes, they just have a different approach in terms of saving lives, kind of at what end of the spectrum. So I'm curious, I mean, like in those situations, they're very extreme situations. And basically you're saying that, like with the case with the plant or whatever in Alabama, yes, so their ears are perked up to be able to listen maybe more keenly than they otherwise would. And it also sounds like, given some of the case studies that you use, and from an educational, like skill acquisition perspective, that you're giving them these examples. Hey, if you know the stakes are really high, you know, Northern Ireland, you know, et cetera, if they can do it, then we can do it. So some of it is just helping people see, well, maybe, you know, my situation isn't as dire, so, you know, it might be easier for me to navigate the space.
Yeah.
What happens when, so that kind of gets them, okay, open to learning, right?
Yeah.
And then they try it. What happens the first time they're not successful at it? Because maybe they're not managing themselves that well in the conversation.
Yeah, it kind of goes back. What we do in the course of a workshop, you spend usually a couple of hours doing one of these workshops. So they get plenty of practice and they get some wins under the belt using the process. And then I think
something that's easier.
We'll do a couple little mini case studies, and then we'll break them into trios, and they'll work on something in their school, something in their neighborhood, something, a family situation, whatever.
Yeah.
So they get a success on that.
Yeah.
Then we say, when you go back to your organization, it's what we said earlier in the interview, don't tackle the longest lasting, intractable problem.
The biggest issue you have.
Yeah. Try something that you get a win under your belt.
Yeah.
It can be used in the most difficult situations. As we've said, it can stop wars. But for your own sake, try it on something a little simpler first.
Yeah. So I'm curious, and again, I want to just remind people that we do have an opportunity to take calls. So if you want to call in, if you want to get some free advice from Steve on maybe a challenging or complex situation that you're having, feel free to call in. So I'm curious, have you ever had a situation where somebody came back to you years later and said, oh my gosh, this has saved my life, this process or approach?
It's interesting because the reason I was down in Louisiana 2 weeks ago was somebody who I hadn't talked to in over 20 years called me and said, hey,
out of the blue.
Yeah, because they had gone through this with me 20, 25 years ago. That happened. That's happened to me 3 or 4 times where I haven't seen somebody in 25 years.
Or talked to them or anything?
Yeah, the same thing. The person, that big church, was in Texas. This guy, I hadn't seen him in over 25 years, and he called me in Connecticut to go down and resolve that dispute in Texas. Because this is, it's the stuff worked back. They knew that it worked back then,
right?
And so it's something they've just kind of kept in their repertoire.
So that must be very rewarding for you.
Well, it's kind of fun. It's because you can really, you don't win every time, but using the win-win principles really improves the likelihood that you'll have a good outcome with somebody.
But I mean, what are the chances of that? Even if you could cite a few that you just mentioned, that you hadn't seen or spoken to these people in 20 or 25 years.
Yeah.
They call you out of the blue. These days it's easier to find people, Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever, than before. They track you down and they ask you to come back to help them out of this challenging, complex situation.
Whatever it is, yeah.
And in those instances where you were called back in after so much time, were those situations successful?
Yeah. It's interesting because
I hope after all that, it's like no pressure now, right?
No, it's interesting because I'm going to be meeting tomorrow with a group. It's an educational group, and what they want is they want win-win problem solving because they're very smart.
Yeah.
They're teachers.
Yeah.
But they realize that they have differences of opinions and they just need a little refresher in how to really solve problems in a mutual beneficial way. And these are teachers.
So this is curious. I mean, it sounds like, so you do workshops, so just generally teaching the people skills and having them apply the skills. And then how much where you're called in in a live situation to do more facilitation / mediation / teach the skills in a live situation that they're trying to problem solve. Because when you're just taking people through a workshop, it's like, okay, the stakes aren't as high. But if it's like, hey, we're calling you in and we're counting on you to fix us.
Yeah.
Essentially, right?
Yeah, there's times where
or fix the situation.
What we love is it's really great if you have an opportunity to teach people this and they can solve their own problems.
Yeah.
But sometimes they need a third party just to come in. There was an example in a pharmaceutical company. There's some very bright people working in with multiple degrees.
Yeah.
And I was called in. There were 2 very senior executives who were really having a clash, and it was tearing their respective departments apart. And so the CEO needed these 2 people to come together because it was just wrecking the organization. And
so I'm curious, did they do any also other kinds of interventions like coaching or anything on the individuals? But it was these 2 were having problems getting along?
These 2 were having problems getting along.
Yeah.
And their respective managers, and these were senior people, their respective managers tried to coach them.
Yeah.
Then somebody said, hey, why don't we bring in somebody who can help mediate the dispute using the word. And so
They use that word, dispute?
Dispute.
Okay, curious.
Dispute. And so I went in, I worked with the 2 of them. I met with them individually.
To understand their interests.
Their interests.
Right.
I met with them individually, and then we met together.
Yeah. And
then about a week later, they walked away with an action plan, and a week later, we did it again, individually together. And we did it again 2 weeks after that. And
so over 6 weeks, 3 times?
Over 6 weeks, 3 times. Because they really were butting heads.
Yeah. So the first time, no, not getting there. The second time,
Well, sometimes when people have been fighting for 2 or 3 years, it's not likely you're going to
do it on the first time.
Break it up on the first shot.
Yeah. So after the first time, it was like, okay, we made some progress.
Yeah.
We're not solved. After the second time, and they still weren't there, how did they walk away?
No, they were getting a lot closer.
They were like, okay.
Yeah, they were starting to put in. They made some agreements on how they were going to use the win-win principles.
Yeah.
And we reviewed how they were using them. Mm-hmm. And then we had a third one just to kind of put the icing on the cake. They made some substantial progress after 1 week. I was pleasantly surprised.
Really?
Yeah.
And so they felt like we're making progress. We all agree we're not there yet,
right.
But because some people would be like, okay. Especially, quite frankly, a lot of executives is like, action, I want it done. It's not, we're not there yet. So, but it sounds like enough progress was made that they had faith that they were going to get closer over time, so they were willing to hang in there and meet with you the second time.
Yeah.
And then what happened between the second and the third time?
They got even better. They just progressively improved.
And so where did they land after the third time? Like, what was the outcome of it?
The third time is they absolutely committed to using the 4 win-win principles.
Yeah.
And then the fundamental skills that go on, undergird that,
yeah.
listening and empathy and really walking that mile in the other person's
shoes.
Mm-hmm, Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. They personally committed to doing that, and then they committed to teach their people how to do it too.
Interesting. And then did you get feedback from the CEO? Because he brought you in, right?
Oh, yeah.
What did he say? Was he like surprised or what?
He was at his wit's end because the decision was if we don't fix this, one of them's going to have to go.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Like this was real, and of course he probably didn't say which one was going to be the one to go, but you were brought in kind of as a last resort.
Yeah.
So you say it's fun. A lot of people would be like, sweating under the collar a little bit, like, okay, a little pressure here, because people's jobs are on the line, right? Well. So you had to deliver. So what did they say at the end of the engagement with you?
Boy, I'm trying to remember. They just appreciated the fact that they thought this was going to go on forever, and so they were just glad they were able to bury the hatchet.
And so the CEO basically said, okay, you did your job.
Yeah.
Like it was successful, and everybody's moving on in a very different way.
Yeah, and it doesn't. Sometimes it's successful.
Right.
Sometimes they're not.
I mean, it's not a panacea. It's not going to fix everything.
Yeah.
But it also sounds like not only did you solve the CEO's headache, right, but you developed their capability, but also the organization's capability, because they committed to also teaching and sharing it with their teams. Yeah. That's really powerful. Yeah, you know that because you're like, yeah, I know. I've been doing this forever.
And that's why some people have the wrong idea about win-win. They think it's kind of like a pushover, easy stuff. It's pretty powerful, and it works.
But it's not necessarily an easy process.
No, it's not easy. You gotta practice like anything.
Right, because sometimes people think win-win. I guess when I first heard that, years ago, I thought, okay, that sounds nice in theory, but at the end of the day, somebody really has to lose.
What we really try to find out is there are ways for, if we go back, the compromise is when you give up something and I give up something. We want to move beyond that. We want to use these 4 principles and practice those skills so we both get what we really want. And
in the situations where you really uncover the interests and they are mutually exclusive, that then frees it up, becomes a lot easier. But where there's some interest of overlap, where it becomes a little bit more complex and dicey to kind of explore the options and the objective criteria.
Yeah, and like almost at the end of any time I give a talk I don't usually give a talk. I usually do a workshop or something like that. People always say, "Hey, well, why don't we do this in Washington?" Well,
yeah, right. That's my question. Okay, we have a few more minutes, but let's talk about that.
I won't name the politicians, but some of the local people here in Connecticut, our senators and congressmen, they're fully aware of what the Harvard Negotiation Project preaches and teaches. And most people realize that we'd never get Congress to sit down and do this kind of thing because they want to just absolutely win. Where I'm crossing my fingers is, wouldn't it be great if we could get a senator's staff to go through a win-win workshop? Because even their own staff has disagreements. And so if they become good practitioners of mutual gains amongst themselves.
They become the way they work.
That's how they work. They're better themselves. And then when they walk across the aisle and deal with the staff on the other side, one of the beauties of win-win, it only takes one to play. You could be a real hardball negotiator. Yeah. If I'm the win-win guy, I can still influence you using my stuff. And so that would be my dream, and I'm working on that one.
Well, I think we really need it in politics today. I mean, I never consider myself a political person, and that's as the case with a lot of people. You feel like these days it's hard not to be, just because of how charged everything is and how sort of bifurcated it is. But I even hear locally, I've been to some, State of the Union updates and things, Eggs and Issue breakfast locally. And I remember I tried to get both Democrats and Republicans, and I'm not affiliated with either one, on this show. And I couldn't get them together on a show. I'm like, why not? Why can't we, come on a show together?
Well, what we try to do, I've done it in local arenas where there'll be a public hearing on the school budget. And anybody can come. And in the old days, they would run these like in a high school, and a volunteer committee is sitting on the stage getting yelled at by people in the audience. You know? And so anybody in the audience can get the mic for like 2 minutes, right? And I'll never forget one time, this was years and years and years ago, a mayor of the town said, "Hey Steve, would you mind getting there like 2 hours early and sitting right next to the mic and you grab it first?"
That's a great strategy.
Yeah, and so what I did is because a bunch of kids from their high school classes had been assigned as a homework assignment to sit in on these hearings, and they were going to watch their parents screaming and yelling at these volunteers up there. And so he says, "Could you just establish a tone of win-win in 2 minutes?" And so I grabbed the microphone and I said, "Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we probably have a common mutual interest here. A lot of our students are here watching you, and you probably want to show them that you can have a disagreement and do it in a way where you're not attacking somebody.
It's respectful."
So I did. I explained. I went through the 2 oranges and gave them the 4 win-win principles. And guess what? They did not yell and scream at the people.
That's
who were
amazing.
Because it was the greater good was for the kids.
But you cited something that said, you set the tone. And right away, that's good to hear that anybody could use. So anybody could use these skills, and you don't have to have the other person using the skills too. But you can influence a different outcome. So we have about 30 seconds left. Time's gone by quickly.
Yes, it does.
2 things in the 30 seconds. Can you give people, if anybody was interested in anything that we talked about tonight and had a question for you, how would they reach you?
If they want it, and by the way, it would be just, I love doing this, I'm very passionate about it, so if you got a question, it's Steve Gardiner 07, Steve Gardiner 07 @gmail.com. Send me an email, and I'd be happy to give you any advice or give you some resources, some books or some suggestions on where you can get
great.
information.
All right. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks very much.
Okay. Suze Shaner with Community Forum. Until next time, thank you for joining us.